Hey, what is up, everybody? Platform Disciple here, and we are finishing off our Rebellion review with the Overseers and the Factionless cards, and we're just going to jump straight into it. Right off the bat, we have Regicide, which I have already talked about, but I have tested it a lot more, and I think the card is quite good, and that really the difficulty is using these two factions together, but if you are in these two factions, I think the card is very powerful, and in matchups where it is less relevant, you can side it out, but it's very good against cards like Chlor, Tibat, Bromic, really anything that you can reliably know what turn it's probably going to come down, it can be very powerful. Okay, next up, Champion's Attendant. Another one we've already looked at. After testing it, I have come to the conclusion that it is all right. It is pretty decent. The stats are not bad. The effect it gives is not bad. It's nothing I'm super excited about, but it's actually, I think, constructed playable. Maybe not the best card in the world, but it is all right. Okay, next up, Declarius the Law, and I think this card is really good. It's amazing. I am using all 4 of my copies in my current Overseers deck, 1 in the command zone and 3 in the deck. Having it in the command zone is particularly nice because he can come straight onto the battlefield and immediately start interfering with how your opponent's attacking. And even if he doesn't come onto the battlefield, your opponent may play around it by putting weaker characters in the front of their assault zone. And other things like that. It's just a very good card. It's extremely powerful against tempo decks, and it's pretty good against aggro decks, and even in matchups where your opponent is not attacking, a 2-cost 6/6 is pretty solid. Okay, next up, Defiant Herald, another one we've already talked about, and my opinion of the card is, even if you're running something like Champion's Attendant or other overcharge cards, in the situation where you don't have an overcharge card, he's just so bad. Like the other Defiant cards, for the most part, have like respectable stats, so that you can, like, I don't know, justify playing them in a case where you don't actually have the card to overcharge them with, or remove them from the game or whatever. But 3 health is phenomenally low. Admittedly, the difference between 3 health and 4 health isn't very much, but they're a lot stronger 2-drops, like, for example, Declarius, that really put Defiant Herald to shame, and I just don't know if it's worth running. One thing is worth noting that I haven't tested but could matter. I haven't gotten to Lilaria yet, but Lilaria is a champion and can overcharge, which satisfies both conditions of Defiant Herald, because you need a champion and you need to be able to overcharge it. So it might have some hope as a constructed playable card, but other than what I've already said, like, I need to see it in action more to really get a sense of how good it is. All right, next up, Gabrielle, the Torch in the Dark, another one we have already talked about, and I think the card is very good. I think it's quite decent as a commander, but my one thing I will say is that with the introduction of all these other new Overseers cards, suddenly Gabrielle has to compete with a lot of very strong cards in the command zone. And I think she is much weaker when she is not in the command zone, because she cannot come straight onto the battlefield and immediately start interfering with your opponent's cards. So, I don't know. And I still think that the best shell for this card is 2 Overseers, 1 Flamed On, because you can use Flamed On's Noble Protector to really keep the card safe in the command zone. I have a deck built around that I have a video on from when Gabrielle cost 2, and she's still good, but when she cost 2, she was so broken. All right, next up, Lilaria, and I do have the alt art now, by the way, in case you didn't catch that from my pack opening video. They managed to fix that pretty quickly, which was really nice. But anyways, I think this card is very good. is the short answer. I like using it in the command zone. The stats are okay, given that it's going to be getting bigger. And the effect is extremely powerful. You're trading one card in your hand for one random card in your opponent's hand, in addition to her getting +2/+2. So you throw away your worst card to have a chance for your opponent to lose something that they actually really need. I like the card a lot, and I think that between Lilaria and Declarius and even Gabrielle, we're seeing a lot of cards, and there's more coming, by the way, that encourage a kind of like aggressive control deck in the Overseer's faction, which I like a lot. Like, these cards can really take control of the game, and you're still on the offense, and I think that's a really interesting dynamic. It's like a tempo control deck. All right, next up, Nemophilist Angel, and this card we've also already talked about, but with the introduction of Martyr of Life and Dragon of the Autumn Wind, and Helix Worm and all these other really big cards, Nemophilist Angel suddenly goes from like kind of like meh to a card that has a very, very clear objective into what it ramps into. And I've tested the card, and you can get up to 10 resources at an astonishing rate, like really, really early in the game. So you can throw down your Martyr of Life or whatever you're ramping into way, way too soon. I don't think it's overpowered or anything, but it definitely fits in a deck type, and I like that a lot. Okay, next up, Raziel the Solitary, and this card is super, super awesome. First of all, it resembles Chlor in how it operates, and anything that functions similarly to Chlor is probably going to be at least like decent, because both of them are one cost. Both of them, I think, really make sense in the command zone specifically, and they also both have the ability to win the game by themselves if they are not addressed very quickly. The primary difference is Raziel can only attack alone to get his buff, which means that you can't, pile the assault zone full of guys. But I think that's okay, because when you're in the double Overseer's faction and you've chosen to use Raziel as your commander, you're probably playing this tempo style control deck that I already mentioned, or a deck that is going to just like Voltron and plan on buffing just Raziel or just Soul or something like that, and you won't actually have that many other guys in the assault zone. And he does hit hard enough and kills people quick enough that you don't need that other pressure in the assault zone. So, very good card. I also really appreciate that it's an uncommon, like compared to Chlor, who is a legendary. You gotta keep in mind what I have said before, which is Chlor makes triple flamed on new players feel kind of like awkward. They're playing a potentially downgraded version of a deck, whereas Raziel is very easy to get your hands on, and in addition, I think Raziel is a very competitive card and gives a very, very good option for players newer to the game to build a powerful deck without having that many rares. All right, next up, Truth Keeper. I like this card a lot. I've tested it. It's pretty nice. The stats are decent, the effect is very nice, but one thing I will say is that it does reveal your opponent's hands, and sometimes I'm able to click on the cards in the opponent's hands to zoom in on them, but other times I can't, which doesn't matter for me as much because I'm so familiar with the cards that I can recognize what they are when they're like really tiny. But for a new player, the card has a less dramatic impact on the game because they can't actually go into their opponent's hands, see what the cards do and what they are. So hopefully that gets fixed or made easier to do in some way. But for the time being, it is a card that only very experienced players can take advantage of the effect, because you have to kind of know the cards by sight. Okay, next up, Angel's Protection. It's one purity, it's a preemptive, and you know, makes your character untouchable for a whole turn. Super, super, super powerful card. Super awesome that it's 1 purity. It opens up a lot of options for how you can be using it. It's also pretty good even in just Overseers, because Overseers has a lot of high priority targets, like we've already discussed. Cards that can really have a huge impact on the game if they are left alone. So Angel's Protection, I think, is a very strong card. Definitely a very strong sideboard card, but who knows, you might even end up using it in the main deck. Next up, Counterspell and Declarius's Edict, which I need to talk about both of these together. They are the same purity. They're both preemptives that block your opponent's next ability card. But Declarius's Edict, you can overcharge it, and if you do, it goes back to your hand. And what I will say is that I like Counterspell a lot better. I would much rather pay 1 less resource in almost every case, rather than have the option to overcharge. Because you got to keep in mind, Declarius's Edict, it's an option. So to justify running Declarius's Edict over Counterspell, you need to be able to say to yourself that the number of times I'm going to be overcharging this effect is worth it costing 1 more. And in the decks I've tested thus far, the answer is I would much rather have 1 resource in almost every case than the option to overcharge. That being said, you could use both in 1 deck, which would be pretty crazy. I think that's probably too much of one thing, especially since you only really need 1 Declarius's Edict if you're going to be overcharging it. And the other thing is that you could have it sideboarded, because Declarius's Edict is extremely powerful against certain decks, and not as powerful against other decks. Like, there's some decks where paying 4 and overcharging it's going to be worth it. But that being said, Counterspell is my favorite of the 2, and I think both of them are very good. Okay, next up, Evict, and we also need to talk about Fight Another Day. Both of these are other couple cards that are very similar, because both of them return a character on the battlefield to its controller's hand. But Evict is 1 purity, which is a big deal, because that means if you're in a 1 purity deck, you can use Evict. And also Evict costs 1 more and puts the character in their hand, makes it cost 3 more. And as of now, I have tested mostly with Evict because I like the card a lot more. Making it cost 3 more, depending on the card you put in their hand, might mean that you don't have to see that card ever again, which is really nice. And by ever again, I mean you end the game before they can really play it. So that's really good. But Fight Another Day also has a lot of potential. I think both of them are pretty solid cards. Right now, I like Evict more. And once again, you could use both, but I don't think you want that many of that effect in 1 deck. Admittedly, you could be really annoying, but I don't know. I like Evict more. I think both cards are decent. Okay, next up, Seal the Rifts. Destroy target location. Its controller's fortress takes 10 damage, and we're going to immediately have to pull up Consecration, because Consecration is the same cost, but has the option to destroy an artifact, whereas the new card cannot destroy an artifact, but the bonus you get for Seal the Rifts is that it does 10 damage, and 10 damage is a ton, especially for a card that's already doing something as good as destroying a location. So I think that the card obviously is a sideboard card, and whether you're going to use it or Consecration is probably going to depend on the meta, because Seal the Rifts is obviously a lot more potent against location cards, but has no effect against the artifact cards. I just want to quickly check the purity of Consecration. Consecration is also 1 purity, so yeah, you're gonna have to make the choice to use one or the other most of the time. I do not think it makes sense to run both on your sideboard unless you're maybe doing like a 2 of one of the other kind of thing. I don't know. Couple more cards in Overseers. Strength of Leadership. This is really powerful. It's pretty low cost. Double purity is pretty acceptable. Like it means nothing when you're buffing a champion, because if you're running champions, you're probably running at least 2 purity. +8 is really huge. And the other thing I said during the pack opening, which was pretty important, is that your primary buff spell before for Overseers can't buff unique characters, it can't buff champions. So having a card that can buff champions is very, very good. And given that it can go onto Soul, who has 2 lives and attacks twice, Strength of Leadership is a phenomenal card. And even if you don't have Soul, I think it's a pretty solid card. Okay, next up, Tower of Truth. Your opponent plays with their hands revealed. It's an artifact, costs 4, 1 purity. So the main thing I have to say about this card is because we have Truth Keeper, I think most decks are just going to run Truth Keeper over Tower of Truth. Admittedly, Tower of Truth does have a pretty nice effect, but I don't know if putting 4 resources is worth having. So like you're spending a lot of resources on a card to see your opponent's hand permanently, when you could just be spending half as many resources, get a character with reasonable stats, and see their hand for 1 turn. So as of now, I don't think Tower of Truth is very good. I think that Truth Keeper is going to be better in almost every case, but we'll have to wait and see. All right, got a few more cards in the Factionless, and then we're going to be done. Marina the Selfless, 3 cost 2/2. When it is deployed, you target a character. When it dies, you receive that character fully healed under your control. I think this card is very good. I think it has a lot of potential. Admittedly, when I've been testing it, I haven't been nearly as successful with the card as I thought I would be. But I could just be using it in the wrong kind of deck. But it can be used either to protect your own high value character by essentially giving it 1 more life, or you can use it on an opponent's high value character when you're planning on removing it. Either case, you're getting a lot of value out of the card. The one thing I will mention is that if you're using it to protect your cards, Descents of the Dragon's got a second wind, which is potentially better, but Marina has more options available, and also Marina does this effect as a deploy effect, and deploy effects happen before abilities, which is pretty important when you're trying to protect something. So I think the card's pretty good is what I'm saying. And whether it's going to be like insanely good, like run 3 in every deck, or whether it's going to be a card that you put maybe a couple of in maybe very specific decks, I don't know. Okay, next we have Time Stopper, who right off the bat I want to say for his resource cost, he has fairly okay stats, but his effect is a very, very weird, unique one, and it makes it so initiative doesn't pass between players. And right now, I don't think that effect is something that is powerful enough to merit playing an entire card to take advantage of it, because like the kind of deck that I imagine wanting that effect would be like a combo deck that feels like it needs priority or needs to not have priority during the turn that it's going to try to combo off. But for combo decks, I think taking up an entire slot that doesn't stall, get you your combo pieces, or is a combo piece, isn't really worth it. And for other decks, I don't know if the effect is worth taking advantage of. I think it's a very cool card, but it's not one that I expect to see very much play. But if someone manages to figure out how to break the card, let me know. And the last one we have is Time for Fun, which is a total goofball card. 1 cost, shuffle 20 random cards into your deck. There's not really much to say here. It's really fun. I don't think it's very good, but I have played with it, and the card is fun, and it's low enough cost and has a pretty dramatic effect on the game that you can even get away using it in like a semi-competitive deck. It's not like, it's never the best decision, but if you compare it to Uncontrolled Rift, the cost is much, much lower, essentially, because Uncontrolled Rift, you pay 2, you get 1 character, and then you have to pay for the character, and the character might not be very good even. Whereas Time for Fun, Time for Fun, you pay the cost once, it's only one, and then you can expect to see a very high variety of cards coming from your deck. So pretty fun. The one last thing I want to say about it is if you play it on turn 1, something very interesting can happen, which is you can get Inevitable Dead into your hand. So if you're running Time for Fun in your deck and you have the option to play it on turn 1, there is a very small chance that you wind up with an Inevitable Dead in your hand, in which case the card is just even slightly better. But for the most part, I think that the Time for Fun card, as the name implies, is for fun. It's not something that you can use to compete. But one last thing I need to say before I close that up is there is the potential for these mill decks that use Acquire to draw your opponent's deck to become good, and having 1 or 2 Time for Funs on your sideboard will probably shut down the deck pretty hard, because they're not going to be able to make you draw, you know, twice as many cards as they were planning on making you draw. So yeah, those are all the cards in Rebellion. If you haven't seen the previous videos, feel free to check them out. They are on my channel. And in the next several videos, I'm going to be exploring decks that use these new cards. And until then, peace out, everyone.